Just a minute, folks. And now I want to remind you that the chat is supervised and we are recording this event. So now I'd like to introduce our presenter today. Our presenter is my colleague Nils Peterson here at NC State. He is an associate professor in our Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology program. His research focuses on coupled human and natural systems, conservation development, managing environmental conflict, and environmental communications. And Nils is going to present to you some of his work today regarding the perceptions of biomass harvesting guidelines among stakeholders in the Southeast. Okay, Nils, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Somebody please text if this isn't working. As Susan mentioned, I think the group of us offering this webinar are pretty new to it today, so hopefully it's interesting material and that makes up for our clumsiness in terms of using the software. I'm the human dimensions person on this biomass harvesting guideline project, and I'm going to present the results of actually some work of two graduate students, Diane Fielding and Chris Serenary, who've been helping us conduct the social science pieces of this project. And as Susan mentioned, you can, if you have a question or something's unclear, you're welcome to text it in. I don't know if I'll be able to keep track of the slides and the text and everything, but at the end of maybe each section of the presentation, I'll check to make sure I didn't miss something. And then I assume at the end of this, we'll have a question and answer session. I shouldn't take the whole time period just talking. So I want to start just by noting that there is a lot of renewable energy policy out there that has created some demand for biomass harvesting. And I don't know necessarily that these particular policies are the most important ones, but they're just examples of what's going on in a sense that there are policies promoting the use of woody biomass as a renewable energy source. And similarly, this is just a little bit of background of where renewable energy comes from. On, I assume, the left of your screen there, you see that the biggest chunk of our renewable energy comes from biofuels, woody biomass together, and that's even more the case if you get outside of places like the Pacific Northwest where you have a lot of hydropower. And then on the right of your screen, I think it's sort of a interesting juxtaposition in the sense that one of the reasons we're interested in this is because there is an increasing demand for woody biomass as a renewable energy, but at the same time, it's kind of one of those things that's going full circle where in many developing countries today and historically throughout the world, the vast majority of our renewable energy and all of our energy indeed came from burning plants. And so we're looking at kind of where we were a long time ago. I want to make sure we have somewhat of a shared definition of woody biomass before we get into the findings. This is the definition we'll be operating on throughout the presentation. That it's a low-value product that are residues from a logging operation like limbs, tops, snags, and small diameter material. And there are obviously a lot of other guidelines out there in terms of how forestry is conducted, and again, this isn't actually, this piece of the project isn't my specialty. We have another PI who's an expert in forest policy, but you're probably aware that we already have best management practices and forest practice guidelines that may be relevant to how biomass is harvested already. And there is some research out there now that does show that coarse woody debris and snags are critical to wildlife habitat and just in general to biodiversity and ecological function of forest ecosystems. And because of that general knowledge that this material does matter ecologically, several states have started moving forward with biomass harvesting guidelines or separate guidelines specifically addressing biomass harvesting. And there's a list here. The number of states is growing. It's probably already outdated. These guidelines generally recommend leaving 15 to 30% of the coarse woody debris on the site after harvest. Minnesota kind of pegs the high end of that with 33%. And I'm going to start in terms of the unique research associated with this project with a qualitative study, and then finish up with a quantitative one where we put some numbers to the issues. So this first piece, a graduate student we see there in the picture, Diane, conducted this study in North Carolina primarily, and to assess what some of the issues associated with biomass harvesting guidelines amongst key stakeholder groups. And so the objective was to understand the perceptions of forest managers, loggers, and forest landowners regarding the economic and operational impacts of potential biomass harvesting guidelines and whether or not these groups would be willing to adopt them. And as I mentioned, it was a qualitative study. What this basically means is instead of asking questions where you can count things up, such as how old are you and you get a number, it's more of a kind of opinions, and the data comes from quotations that people provide. Diane used a snowball sampling method, which is where she found key informants, people that were well connected within each of the communities, such as landowners or loggers, and then asked them to recommend other people. And basically continued doing interviews until she got all the same answers and wasn't getting new information. And she conducted 20 interviews within each of the stakeholder groups that we talked to. These are just some general demographics of the people who Dan talked to. In terms of all the groups, they were mostly male. The forest managers were kind of split between private industry and consulting foresters. There was a small group that were working for government agencies. They all had 4-year college degrees, averaged about 50 years old. The loggers were all male, similar age. Over half of them were already harvesting woody biomass as part of the operations they were conducting. This gives you kind of just an idea of where most of the loggers were doing their actual work. The forest landowners were a little bit older than our loggers and forest managers, and almost all of them had a management plan on their property. And again, this just gives you an idea of where the landowners that Diane interviewed actually owned property. One of the general ideas that came out of this was that the stakeholders were opposed to biomass harvesting guidelines, and we can't say what, because this was a qualitative study. We can't say, well, this reason was more important than that one, or X% felt this way. But it just gives us an idea of some of these sentiments that were out there that we might not have anticipated. And one was that the BMPs that we already have are already successful and they're good enough. And a related theme that came out of the interviews was that woody biomass harvesting is just a regular component of conventional harvesting that doesn't really change what's going on, so you don't need new regulations. And finally, there was concern that there wasn't really scientific data suggesting that harvesting woody biomass created negative environmental impacts. So this is just a statistic showing that BMPs are implemented in the majority of cases in North Carolina. What you're going to see here are some of the quotes. There were obviously many quotes that we drew these themes from, but this is just an example of one logger who was commenting on this issue of biomass harvesting not really changing the way harvest operations occurred in the first place. And for these quotations, I'm probably not going to read them to you. That way you can kind of look at the slide and not just listen to me talking the whole time. Then this is a quote from a forest manager reflecting that sentiment that there really wasn't scientific research demonstrating the negative ecological or environmental impacts of biomass harvesting. And again, the names are on there, but they're not the actual names of the informants. One other concern that informants had, they believed that the potential for biomass harvesting guidelines reflected just a general distrust of the forest industry amongst the public, so that they weren't grounded in a need per se, rather they were grounded in the general public not trusting the forest industry and just assuming they needed to have rules there. Another sort of perceived grounding for the BHGs was the idea that stakeholders felt that the public was afraid of a desolate site, or something they would see as desolate, like this picture here, and that was what the BHGs were being proposed as a response to. And amongst the forest managers and loggers, there was a theme, a common sentiment that BHGs threatened the viability of biomass harvesting. Basically, that there were small margins already, and if they required a little bit of extra work or changes in the way things were done, that it wouldn't be feasible anymore. Another concern that forest managers and loggers had was that it wasn't operationally feasible to figure out how much woody debris was left on a site. You can see that in the quote there. And if you remember the intro, many of these states had very specific amounts, 10%, 33%. And the basic concern here is that that's not something that was possible. And I don't want to get into details from other presentations from this series, but I think our project has demonstrated that it is very difficult to be accurate in terms of how much is left on the landscape. Forest landowners also indicated a concern about the lack of a clear definition for woody biomass. They were interested in it as an additional forest product and wanted some sort of government support, such as subsidies, to get the woody biomass market moving. On the same time, they saw some of these BHGs as a potential infringement on property rights. And Diane very tastefully replaced the expletive in this quotation. This is just an example of one of the quotes where landowners were expressing that concern about property rights that might be associated with BHGs being established. Although the general sentiment we saw in these themes was negative towards biomass harvesting guidelines, there were some potential upsides that were identified by the stakeholders. They're summarized here. Some of the consulting foresters saw the potential that this would potentially increase some business for them. The stakeholders also thought that it might make forest management more proactive, help stabilize soil and limit erosion. And some people also identified the potential for an increase in wildlife habitat associated with BHGs. But I think in the next section of this presentation, you'll see that even though this was identified, it didn't reflect the general sentiment of the stakeholders involved. So the informants also had some recommendations for what might be done with BHGs if they needed to be implemented. One was that they needed to be somehow contextual, that they wouldn't fit on a statewide level, that they needed to be done in a local type way. So some of the conclusions from this qualitative portion of our study where the stakeholders did or were concerned about economic and social impacts of additional regulations, and that they felt that any biomass harvesting guidelines would be largely redundant with already existing guidelines that are out there. There was also some concern about the degree to which science currently suggests negative impacts from woody debris removal of any level. And finally, there were perceptions that the various attributes of BHGs, like how much biomass was required to be retained on the site, was simply too difficult to operationalize. And some of the recommendations that emerged from this would be that BHGs would be better if they were somehow integrated local context into the regulations, that we need a better definition of woody biomass, or a shared one amongst stakeholders, that we need to develop guidelines based on better science, or at least communicate the science that exists better, and that we need to develop not only standard but viable protocols for measuring the amount of biomass, both initially on the site and left afterwards per potential BHG guidelines. So now I'm going to move into the quantitative portion of the project, and this one both changes from this qualitative, searching through the quotations to get ideas, to a quantitative approach, and also from a North Carolina focus to a focus that expands to the southeastern U.S. We took some of the general ideas, concerns people had about whether or not you could measure the amount of biomass retained and things like that, and then put them into a survey where we could actually compare exactly how important each of these attributes were to stakeholders in the Southeast. And I'm not going to get too deep into the methods here, both because it might stretch my understanding of them, and they're fairly complex, and I think the results are more interesting than the methods. So we did use choice models in this study, and the basic idea behind these is that a way to figure out how important each attribute of a policy is kind of like trying to understand how important attributes of a consumer good are. So these methods are typically used to measure attributes of products people buy. One of our collaborators conducted a study on lattes and looked at how much they cost, how good they tasted, and the ambiance in the coffee shop or something, and those were attributes. So we obviously have different attributes for biomass harvesting, but that's the basic idea in terms of giving someone a product, quote unquote, and letting them pick between products to see which they prefer. We conducted an online survey where respondents were basically given 12 choices where they could say, I want this package for biomass harvesting, or I prefer this package, or I just don't want any of them. And I think I'm going to give you a quick summary of what those look like. Yeah, so the packages people were given had varying levels for each of these 4 attributes. So it could be 10, 20, or 30% of the woody debris remaining. The woody debris could be required to be spread out, put in piles, or piled in rows, or scattered in piles. And stumpage price received could be $0 per ton, $3 per ton, or $6 per ton, and the wildlife habitat afterwards could be low, medium, or high. So if you'd imagine if you were taking this, you'd be given 2 scenarios where each of these levels were randomly selected, and you could choose one of those 2 or opt out totally each time. So you might get, do you want one that's 10% of the biomass left, put in piles and $3 a ton with good wildlife habitat? Or would you prefer one that's got 30% left behind, put in windrows, $6 per ton, and low quality wildlife habitat? And you pick which one you want. And then through some complicated statistics, we're able to determine how important each of these attributes are, and also how important the different levels of each attribute are. In terms of sampling, it got pretty complicated, but the general idea is we went out to each of the stakeholder groups and found their membership lists and sent the email surveys out to their members. There were a couple of groups that didn't want to share their list, and so they pushed out the survey for us. The downside was, because of that, we weren't able to come up with a really good idea of non-response. So what we had to do was compare the responses from people that answered really early to the ones that sort of struggled in 4 or 5 weeks later to see if there were differences there, and there weren't, so we kind of made the assumption that since there weren't differences over time, there probably weren't major differences between the people who did and didn't respond. So we were kind of using the how long it took people to get around to it as a sort of substitute for whether they got around to it at all. And it didn't seem to have a big impact. Okay, so I kind of covered this, that sort of using the how long people took to respond and seeing whether they differed or not was this continuum resistance model, which basically, and it showed that we didn't have a lot of bias if you accept that assumption that the people who were responding late are kind of like the people who didn't respond at all. And we calculated two sort of important statistics. One was utility scores, which determined how important each of those attributes and levels were. And then we also looked at interactions between attributes and variables. And I talked about important scores. It's basically just how important each of the attributes are to the respondents in terms of which choices they make. And then we compared those important scores using ANOVA between the various stakeholder groups. And I'm going to skip this. This is just Sawtooth as a proprietary software designed for analyzing these types of studies that was used to do the analysis. We also were able to create our own policy scenarios rather than the randomly generated one, just to compare in terms of what % of the respondents would pick one of these scenarios. And our naming might be a little bit unfortunate. We've gone around and around trying to pick what we should name these. But the BHG wildlife scenario was one that had a high price, stumpage price, but also had the best wildlife habitat and also the best distribution and % remaining theoretically for wildlife, which was more left behind and a spread out distribution. Then we had reduced costs, which is sort of also like saying the maximum profit in terms of the highest price per ton, the least biomass left on the site, and a pod distribution, because that's typically what's done anyway. The theoretical wildlife, again, is the highest value for wildlife. And then balanced 1 and 2 are ones where you produce high quality wildlife habitat at the same time you produce the high revenues. So this gives you an idea of our sample. It was biased towards North Carolina and Georgia, but we did have a decent number of respondents from Virginia and South Carolina. Most of our respondents were foresters, but we had about 100 loggers and 100 landowners, and very few ENGOs, although we tried to reach out to them. The sample was, again, mostly male and about 50, so it reflected largely the demographic we saw in the qualitative study, and the average income was within the range of $75,000 to $100,000 a year. So this is the first big chunk of results, and I know it's pretty complicated, so we'll take a little bit of time to go through it. Basically, the utility score, if it's above 0, it means it's something that the respondents prefer. If it's below 0, it's a negative quality for that attribute. So if you look on the left side of your screen, you have the wildlife habitat quality, and low habitat quality has a strong negative utility for the overall sample, and high habitat quality has a very high utility. Now, the next set of 3 bars is showing the stumpage price, and it's obviously 1, the most important variable, and 2, it has the broadest spread. So the biggest positive utility of anything in here was having the highest stumpage price. The biggest negative was not having any value for that woody biomass. And then in terms of the distribution or the actual operational variables, they were significantly different, but they were relatively less important compared to wildlife habitat and stumpage price. So even though they weren't as important, the utility scores were significantly different in terms of distribution. The respondents preferred to have it spread the most. The second most preferred was to put it in piles, and the last was to put it in windrows. And when it comes to the percent left on the landscape, obviously the least left was the most preferred, and leaving 30% was the least preferred. So this gets to the percent importance scores for each of these variables, and we touched on this in the last slide. Stumpage price is close to twice as important as everything else. And then you've got wildlife habitat quality, distribution, and the amount of debris that's remaining. I think the other key finding that you'll see on this slide is that there were minuscule and statistically insignificant differences between the loggers, the landowners, and the foresters. So when it came to thinking about attributes of BHGs, there were basically no difference. These stakeholder groups had the same perspectives on each of these attributes and on their levels. There were some other sort of pieces of the questionnaire that weren't directly related to this attribute experiment that we did, and that's what's summarized here in the extra info slide. All the groups thought that BHGs would increase costs for loggers, so that 62% puts a number on that concern we saw in the qualitative study. Similarly, most of the stakeholders did think there would be some benefits for them financially by harvesting woody biomass. And most of the stakeholders, or a small minority of the stakeholders disagreed. That was 15%. So there was a decent group that were sort of in the neutral. They weren't sure what whether they'd benefit or not. The other interesting finding here was that even though there was a strong, very significant relationship between wildlife habitat quality and which of these biomass harvesting scenarios the stakeholders preferred, where they preferred ones that produced higher wildlife habitat quality, most of the stakeholders did not think that harvesting the biomass would hurt wildlife habitat. So that's sort of an interesting twist in the sense that it was an important, the stakeholders really cared that this wanted to make sure these options provided good wildlife habitat, but they didn't necessarily think that biomass harvesting would impact it. And this is where we looked at those artificially created policies to see how the specific examples would work out that we had talked about before. And I'll kind of refresh your memory on these as we look through it. So a key thing here to look at first is that the no scenario is preferred over everything except for balanced one. So one that sort of maximizes wildlife habitat in terms of leaving more biomass on the ground. Even though it fares okay, the stakeholders would rather not have any of them than do that. The only one that they preferred over nothing was this balanced one category, and that was the one that had the maximum stumpage price to $6 per ton. It had medium quality wildlife habitat, 20% coarse woody debris remaining versus 10 or 30, and it had a pile distribution in terms of how it was distributed on the landscape. So some of the conclusions we can come to based on both of these sections. One would be that the stakeholder groups we looked at have an almost identical view of BHGs and biomass harvesting in general. There isn't a lot of divisive issues here, at least for those stakeholder groups. Another is that stumpage price is the most important variable here in terms of criteria for BHGs. The third is that impacts on wildlife habitat quality are more important than operational issues like how the biomass is distributed or how much is left, but that the stakeholders don't really believe harvesting biomass impacts wildlife habitat. And then finally, that unless BHGs improve revenue and wildlife habitat simultaneously, the stakeholders would rather not have them at all. Some recommendations based on these conclusions, I think, would be that to develop BHGs that are sort of followed and accepted, there needs to be the minimal percentage of CWD retained to achieve ecological objectives, and piles would be better off than rows if evenly spread CWD isn't ecologically acceptable. And in terms of communicating or outreach associated with BHGs, it's important to articulate how BHGs might improve stumpage prices, say because prices go up with some sort of certification or something. And it's also important to articulate how it would improve wildlife habitat, because it's important, even though right now the stakeholders don't really see a connection there. And I am not sure exactly how we move to discussion here, but that's what I would like to do at this point.
Okay, Niels, this is Susan. I will jump in here and say thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting stuff that you guys, Diane and Chris, found there. So, ladies and gentlemen, we would love to take your questions typed into the chat box, and Niels will answer the questions. I'll read them out to make sure that everyone gets the question, and then Niels will respond. But while we're waiting for a question, Niels, I have a couple questions for you. So do you, as a wildlife biologist, do you assume that more coarse woody debris equals higher quality habitat?
Well, I'm a half-baked wildlife biologist because I've done sort of shifted so much into human dimensions and sociology work. But I think it is pretty clear that more is better for some species. But I don't think you can say it's better for all species. So it really is species specific. It's not something that's going to apply across the board. And I think some of the work that Chris Moorman and our colleagues at Georgia have done in terms of looking at impacts on wildlife have shown that there's some species that it matters for and some that it doesn't, and it really depends, even within groups. So it benefits some amphibians, not others, and the same thing with birds and small mammals. So one of the tricks with this is that it does matter, but it's too complex to make just a blanket statement.
Okay, I see. I understand, because I was wondering about that, and one of our participants was wondering the same thing, and commented in the chat that even the term woody biomass is pretty ambiguous, and that wildlife habitat, you know, which, if you're saying high quality, for which species, which is just what you pointed out. And you would have to know what species you were targeting in order to know their habitat needs, right? And if it was going to benefit them or not to have more.
Right. Yeah. So this is, I mean, this was something that, in terms of the survey, was hypothetical. So it's saying if whatever those guidelines are that people came up with made the wildlife habitat better, then would it be something that would make that particular option a choice that you'd be more likely to prefer? Mm-hmm. So there is some subjectivity, and the wildlife habitat quality was probably the most subjective one versus, you know, 10, 20, 30% piled, spread. It was subjective. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it was something that was important to the stakeholders. Mm-hmm. You saw it was clearly more important than distribution and percent left on the site, and less important than stumpage price.
But didn't your one, the one study, the quantitative one, unless I got this mistaken, that leaving 30%, and the utility analysis, that leaving 30% was the least preferred in terms of coarse woody debris?
Right. So the idea was, in general, the stakeholders the more they could take off the site, the better.
Okay, but that seems to not balance with their concern for habitat. But maybe
well, I think Chuck's comment sort of gets at that. This is the interesting thing. Basically, and it's something we have some insight from because of the question. So most of the respondents thought taking more, they basically thought there's no evidence that hurts wildlife.
Yeah.
So behind that decision-making process, I think one of the things we saw was that they thought wildlife habitat was more important than how much they took, but they didn't think how much they took impacted the wildlife habitat. So that was their decision-making process.
I see, yeah.
Whether that matches up with what people are finding now is another question.
Right.
And I think that's still up in the air. The research on these impacts is still relatively new, and it's sort of coalescing for some species, but it's something that's still up in the air. So their sort of idea that it isn't a direct negative impact to take more, for some species is probably correct.
Right. Okay. So Ron provides this comment: need to distinguish between total biomass harvesting, in parentheses clear cut, versus chipping tops from thinning. Do you have a
Yes, so this was, I may not have got into it in the presentation, but this was distinguished. So in this particular study, it was, and I'm adopted into a forestry department, so I don't know exactly what the details here, but it was articulated as the second option Ron brought up. This was described as biomass harvesting of sort of the leftovers. It wasn't.
Okay, so it was
everything down and running it all into the chipper.
So
right?
So harvesting just meant removing the debris left after a regeneration harvest, not a thinning. I mean, this was like a final harvest on a site.
Yeah, so this was framed as something that was tacked on to a traditional harvest that was done for, other purposes.
Yeah, for saw timber. Or,
yeah.
Okay. All right. So that, and then I'm just curious too, was so the definition that you gave at the beginning, that was provided to the definition of woody biomass, that was provided in the survey?
Yeah, so the survey provided that, and it also gave them a brief description of how the harvest went in terms of like addressing Ron's question.
Okay.
What the coarse woody debris was that was being used. And
since you were dealing with foresters, loggers, and landowners, certainly they had, for the most part, an understanding of that.
Yeah, we pre-tested it on them. So the graduate student went out to a sample of those stakeholders and ran the survey by them to make sure it made sense. But you are right. I mean, I think most of our respondents had a better idea of what chipping tops and total biomass harvesting was than I do.
Well, that's okay. We'll teach you all that stuff. Hang around us foresters. Okay, so another question. How does the relationship between wildlife habitat and coarse woody debris change with stand development?
I'm assuming this means as the stand gets older?
Right, yes, correct. Yeah.
I'm going to have to defer that question to our next one, presentation or when we do the biological one. But I think it has I would guess, man, I don't really know. I mean, you're going to have different wildlife species in a stand as it ages. You've got, when it's first cut, you're going to have species that are early successional species that live in an open environment, and it's going to totally change as the stand gets older. In terms of the value of what CWD is left on the stand, how that changes for those different species during succession, I honestly don't know. I'd have to defer that to one of our listeners who might know, or the next presentation.
Yeah, because I had another similar question. How does the regeneration of the new stand come into play? So, because the slides you showed, we didn't see any advanced regeneration. In other words, we didn't see any seedlings or saplings already on the site at the time of harvest.
Right. So the slides we had where that hadn't happened yet, I think were more just demonstrating in the qualitative study where some of the stakeholders thought BHGs were emerging out of a public fear of the desolate site. Obviously in these places, you know, within a year it looks nothing like that.
Yes, and
you know, green and changing quick.
Right.
But that's where those pictures were from. It wasn't so much the sense. They weren't there so much in the sense of, you know, we were focusing on, you know, the first 3 weeks after harvest or something like that in terms of the study.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I was also thinking that with this question about the interplay between the importance of coarse woody debris for wildlife habitat with the regeneration of the stand, just wanting to comment that, of course, your coarse woody debris, particularly the smaller stuff, it's not going to last very long on the site. So it's really, you know, you're going to have, as you have the stand development, you're going to have a trade-off there. So you're not really going to have both for very much part of time. So.
Yeah, and I think that would be sort of a topic that hopefully would emerge in one of our other presentations, because they did do some work looking at like nutrients and things like that across the sites and also at various distances away from the biomass windrows or piles to see how much of an impact there was on nutrients and how long it persisted over time. So we do have that information, but I don't know what it is.
Oh, good. Well, it might be presented, and we still have 4 additional webinars based on all this research coming up in this series, so maybe we'll find that out. Here's a good question that Jim points out, Nils, and I'm curious too about this. He says that it's an apparent contradiction. It looked like the majority thought that BHGs would increase the cost to loggers, but they also thought that it would benefit them financially. So do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, it does seem to contradict, and my initial assumption here would be that the BHGs themselves are going to increase costs, but that I think the question there at this in the presentation, I don't know if I can zip back. Yeah, I think I can. The question was about, I think, biomass harvesting. And so they saw the biomass market itself as something that would benefit. Yeah, so if you see here on the second bullet, most thought that harvesting the biomass would be something that would help them financially, but the BHGs themselves, they thought is something that was going to cut into that.
I see. Okay, so the guidelines would maybe cut into their financial benefit, is what they were thinking.
Right, and then so that was one of the recommendations, is that if you're going to implement guidelines, you have to show how some way that might actually help with revenue versus cutting into revenue. And you know, some people might not think that's possible, but the initial argument I would assume would go there would be that having some sort of certification would improve the markets. Well,
Nils, I wonder if you're aware of the answer to this, because last week we had a webinar with Xander Evans from the Forest Guild, and he presented information that there's at least half a dozen states that already have BHGs in place. And those recommendations that came out of this particular study about predicting successful implementation of BHGs, do you know how it's going in those other states, and if they were focusing at all on the financial when they promoted the guidelines?
I don't. I think, though, in looking at that information, one could look at what's happened to their markets since they implemented them, and that would be an interesting exercise. It would be a tricky sort of chicken and the egg type of thing, in the sense that I would guess that the states who have implemented BHGs They may be states that politically, for whatever reason, are slightly more concerned about some of these issues, but arguably there are probably also states where there's a bigger market or it's a bigger issue. So they might have better revenue, not because the BHGs make it easier to sell, but because there's more demand and the BHGs just went along with that. So if you go with it, there's going to be data out there, but then the remaining question would be, is that increased revenue or better revenue for the biomass?
Okay.
From the demand or from the fact that people can trust that it's not ecologically damaging?
Right. So what would you say are the top research questions that came out of this particular study that should be followed up on?
I mean, I think that those would largely relate to some of these recommendations that I talked about at the end, in terms of how might you communicate the science about the impacts of biomass harvesting to key stakeholder groups. And as we discussed earlier, some of the verdict is still out on some of those things, but we are going to get the answers. And then how do you communicate that to the stakeholders in a way that is likely to be accepted? Would be one important one. And of course, I'm thinking of sort of social research as opposed to ecological research.
Right. So Bob H asks, have you compared this to similar studies in other areas of the U.S.? I'm not sure there have been any, but how would you know?
Yeah, so we haven't compared it to other studies in other areas of the U.S. That might be because there haven't been any. It might be because they're just really new and those results are coming out in webinars and stuff, but not in the literature, kind of like where ours are right now.
And some of this was actually published. I believe Diane's study was.
The qualitative part is published, and there is some literature kind of on the BMPs versus the BHGs that is very similar to what we found from other regions of the U.S. and even other places in the world. The quantitative piece we haven't published, and I haven't seen much of anything like it in the literature. But I imagine there will be other things coming out soon because this is a U.S.-wide issue. Yes, this is very timely, and there's definitely been some work in Minnesota. Minnesota is one of the states that has guidelines. In the southeast, I think just South Carolina has some guidelines. So I don't see any more questions coming through, Nils, but let me thank you again and say that to everyone that, again, this is part of a series, and this was a 4-year research project between us, NC State, and the University of Georgia, and we looked at several aspects of surrounding biomass harvesting guidelines, and we'll start getting into more of the ecology and biology of some of these studies in our future webinars. So now, if you would like to have credits, we have Wildlife Society credits, and we have Forestry credit, 1 hour for each. And you just have to take this quiz that Helene is going to push out to you. There it is. There's the link for the quiz. And I think that's all. Helene, do we have to add anything else before we sign out?
That's it. I should be pushing everyone out. Put it in the push out window so they should be seeing the continuing education credits. And it's also in the chat window if anyone has any problem accessing it. And also you can always contact Susan if you have any problems obtaining your continuing education certificate. Just go ahead and send her an email and we'll take care of that. But that's it, Susan.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Nils. Bye-bye.
Bye.